think it depends on the type of PTSD, regardless of whether that experience was more recently in Afghanistan or some time ago in Vietnam.
G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today is the last episode in our series on PTSD. We are talking with Clare Mitchell about PTSD recovery in veterans. Clare is a psychologist and the National Clinical Manager of Mates for Mates, a charity that helps veterans and their families affected by service. And after her own 6-year service in the Royal Australian Air Force, Clare became a psychologist in 2014 and now specialises in treating PTSD. Hello Clare, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Hi Jack, thank you for having me on today.
What is your role at Mates for Mates, Clare?
I'm the National Clinical Manager, so I'm responsible for the clinical team at Mates for Mates, and that includes psychologists, social workers, counsellors and exercise physiologists.
And what does Mates for Mates focus on? Is it veterans?
Yes, that's right. So we are a ex-serving organisation, an ESO, and we provide support to veterans who've been impacted by their service as well as their family members. So in terms of the services that we provide, there is an eligibility criteria, and as I say, we do some eligibility checking around that those impacts of service. So we provide, we have services in 4 different service streams. Clinical services, including psychology and counselling. And we also have our exercise physiology services, so our physical rehab and wellbeing. Then we have our social connection, and that's run through our family recovery centres. And we have recovery centres in Townsville, Brisbane, Hobart, and an interim centre in Darwin as well as some outreach centres in Launceston, Cairns and Ipswich. And we have liaison officers in those centres, and they're all people who've got lived experience, and by that we mean they're all ex-serving ADF members. So they have an awareness and understanding of some of the challenges that people in the ADF or who've been in the ADF may experience. And they run a number of social connection activities, things like bike rides, barbecues, craft activities, family days, that kind of thing. And then we have our skills for recovery programs, and they're all clinically led programs run by our psychologists, counsellors, social workers and EPs, and they make up a range of different things. So, for example, this year we've had a program on addictions, we've had a program on partners and focusing on partners and carers and their experience, so really kind of looking, I suppose, at the family members. And coming up, we've got events for Men's Health Week and Women's Health Week. So that's just a range of the kind of programs that we have. We also do some residential programs as well, 4-day programs. So there's a lot of psychoeducation and understanding and some skills building in those programs as well. And they're all for small groups.
How common would you say PTSD is in the veterans that are coming to Mates for Mates?
I would say, obviously the mates that we have, they all have some kind of impact of service, and it's certainly not uncommon for them to have a range of different mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, adjustment disorder, and certainly we do get a significant number who've had or who have an experienced PTSD.
When do you find is the time that a veteran comes to get help with their PTSD? Is it when it's like when they've hit rock bottom, or is it when it's starting to kind of happen, or what do you think?
I think it depends, to be honest with you. I mean, we have some people who are current serving who do come and have some awareness that, often things aren't quite right. It may be that they don't necessarily recognise that as PTSD at the time, and some of the things that they may experience are, issues within their relationships. They might find themselves being increasingly moody or angry, and those can make, functioning in the world quite difficult. It might be difficult for them to work. It might be difficult for them to manage being around their families, do things like going to shopping centres, that kind of thing. So I think very often they will come to us with, I've got all these things going on, what's happening? Sometimes, but not always, they may not recognise, as I say, that there's a mental health issue like PTSD occurring. And that's when partly, the job of the psychologist, the counsellor, to support them and raise their awareness and understanding.
Do you find that a lot of veterans find it hard to ask for help with their PTSD?
Yes, I think so, and I think that kind of comes back to some extent to the nature of the ADF. Certainly very difficult, if you imagine that acknowledging or putting your hand up and saying, I have these problems, it certainly has an impact on all kinds of aspects that they may, of their professional experience that may be difficult. So they may not be able to deploy, and they may face medical discharge as well. So I think that makes it very difficult for people to acknowledge, mental health challenges and to ask for support because of those potential consequences.
Does recovery with PTSD look different in veterans than, say, everyday kind of people with PTSD?
From my experience, I think the recovery is the same or similar. I think everyone's recovery from PTSD is different. I think it depends on the type of PTSD. It depends on, what's actually happened, how long it takes to be able to acknowledge. And I guess the support that they have as well. So, whilst the psychologists and the counsellors are important around supporting PTSD, often it's about engaging in other activities as well. So we know that one of the symptoms of PTSD tends to be that withdrawal. If you're experiencing significant symptoms such as kind of hypervigilance, being nervous around people, not liking, being in crowds, it can be really difficult to engage socially. So learning how to engage or having opportunities to engage in social situations, especially with other people who may have experienced similar things to you, I think is really important and certainly helps people coping. I think that it's important for anyone who has PTSD, whether that's through experiences in the ADF or any other experience. I think the main thing is for them to seek appropriate support.
What are some of the signs that someone does have PTSD? Like, what attributes are you looking out for?
Sure. Well, there's a few things that people may have experienced. And obviously the first one is that they've experienced some kind of threat. And that doesn't have to be an actual threat, but if they perceive that there was a threat of death or serious harm, either directly themselves or through hearing about it, that would be something that we'd be looking for, that they've experienced that. And then I guess there's a few kind of clusters of symptoms that people may have. And one of them is that they may experience dreams, flashbacks. The situation may come back to them at a time that they don't want it to. They don't want to remember it, but it keeps coming back. They may also try and avoid situations that trigger difficult memories. They may try to avoid either situations, or they may even try to avoid their thoughts about it. So they may do other things to avoid thinking about a difficult situation or a situation that was very threatening to them. They may change how they feel about the world, so it can have an impact on their thought processes, their cognitions and their mood. And the kind of things, I suppose, that we might see would be that, generally you can be going on in your life and you can have the belief that the world is generally a fairly safe place and that we're generally a good person and that other people aren't necessarily out to get us and we can generally trust them. One of the things that we notice in people who've experienced or who have PTSD is that those beliefs are very, very changed. So it might be that they don't believe the world is a safe place. The world feels very dangerous. They don't feel like a good person, and they can't generally believe or trust that other people are that are not out to get them. And that can be really, really difficult. It's a hard way to live in the world when you have this idea that the world isn't generally a safe place. And the other thing is that hypervigilance. So that's, being very reactive to things, loud noises, lots of people, those kind of things. So those will be the things that we'd be looking for to, make an assessment that maybe someone is experiencing PTSD.
How old are the veterans that are usually seeking help? Are they modern veterans or is it kind of varied?
It's varied, yeah. So we have a range of different veterans, all the way from older veterans who've been to Vietnam, for example, and down to people in their 20s, early 20s. So I think there's a range of people that are accessing support, and I think it's really important that at Mates for Mates we try to make ourselves as available for that support as we can. So something I didn't mention earlier on, we do have online programs as well. So we can do our clinical appointments through an online program, but we can also do all of our social connection activities online as well. So we're trying to reach out to whatever veterans of whatever age that we can in order to provide them the support that they might need.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Clare Mitchell, and we are discussing PTSD recovery in veterans. And I would imagine as a psychologist, in interacting with the different kind of generations, would it be a bit different generation to generation and how you kind of interact with them and how you kind of get them to open up about the experiences that they had?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I guess it can, but I think with everyone that we treat as a psychologist, it's about having understanding of their experience, regardless of whether that experience was, more recently in Afghanistan or some time ago in Vietnam. I think as a psychologist, the most important thing you can do is be empathic and understand the situation as best as you can from their perspective. That therapeutic relationship is really one of the first things in the process of developing, an effective strategy as a psychologist. We need that therapeutic relationship to be strong in order to, move forward and actually do some of the work that's required to be done with the client.
How can we help some of the older generations that may have an old mentality towards mental health, like just suck it up kind of thing? Mm-hmm. Like how do we help them if they're going through, PTSD?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think it's about talking about it. It's about normalising it. It's about allowing them or letting them know that help is available for everyone. And I think that ADF experience, one of the difficulties with it is that, part of the ADF training is that you're not allowed to show weakness. You're not allowed to let the team down. And if you're seen as weak in any way, that can be seen as letting the team down. And I think it's important to normalise the difficulties that people may have and to talk about it, to ensure that everyone knows that support is available. And as I say, it's not just the clinical support, it's the other programs as well. I mean, sometimes I guess we have people who come to us as a bit of what we might call a bit of a soft entry. So they might come to Mates for Mates in order to do a social connection activity. And then through that interaction with other people, that might be where they start to have those connections and start to think, oh, actually, yeah, that symptom or that thing, that behaviour that person's talking about, maybe I can recognise that in myself, and maybe it would be helpful for me to see a psychologist or do one of the skills for recovery programs to learn a bit more about that and step a bit more into the clinical side of the services we have at Mates for Mates.
Do we need to work on the stigma that may still be there within the military towards PTSD?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I not just PTSD, I think all mental health issues. The reality is that a large percentage of us at some time will experience a mental health issue. And I think it's important that we provide appropriate care and support. And as I say, that people are aware that support is out there for them and that support is for everyone, not just for some people in some situations.
Is it possible to recover from PTSD?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And I think recovery looks different for lots of people. So it can be possible to overcome the difficulties that you're experiencing, to manage the symptoms. The reality is that if someone's experienced trauma, it's certainly going to change the way that they potentially understand the world, but that doesn't mean that it can't, that they can't, develop strategies and ways of working that allow them to function appropriately, even with that difficult experience. And it's about how that's managed. So, managing PTSD, treatment of PTSD also involves some skills development as well as the actual interventions that we use for processing traumatic memories.
What are some of the ways that people can manage their PTSD and, still live a really good life?
So I guess, in terms of skills development and that kind of thing, I think it's about learning to communicate. It's about learning to regulate emotions, about learning to, step into, to some extent, some of the things that may have become very challenging, because the more we avoid something, the more we want to avoid it, and the more we have to avoid it to avoid distress. So to some extent, it can be about learning to sit with some distress, and at the same time, there's some more specific treatments around actually processing the memories, and that can be about, it doesn't mean that the memories go away. It just means that the memories don't necessarily impact on people in such a major way on a day-to-day basis. So they can have the memories without the memories being really present. One of the things I talked about earlier was those intrusive symptoms, and that can be that sometimes people actually experience the memory as though they were back in that situation. And obviously that's very confronting, that's very difficult to deal with. So part of the treatment for PTSD is to acknowledge that, for them to get to a stage, I suppose, to acknowledge that those memories are there and that they can still access those memories, but the memories aren't so confronting and they don't impact on them in the present moment as much.
What is the attitude that someone needs to have when they're kind of undertaking recovery?
Look, I think it's important that they come with an open mind, if possible. And I totally understand that, people can be sceptical at times, particularly when there's challenges to, it's not something that you've necessarily been able to kind of step into. Maybe not because you've not wanted to, but because it's not been part of the culture or the attitude. But I think it's important that if people can come with that attitude as best as possible, and it's about having an open mind. And I'm going to say that it's okay for someone to come and not feel that they connect or click with a particular psychologist. I would hope that wouldn't put them off, and that they would say, well, actually, I just need to find someone that I can really work with. I think that's absolutely fine, because it is about that relationship as well. And I think it's about wanting to develop a relationship, and I guess doing a bit of work as well. Some of the work, the skills development, there is some work required in that, and depending on the psychologist, we all have different approaches, different ways of doing things. There'll potentially be some homework or whatever you want to call it, or work outside of sessions. Others may not, but I think it's about finding a psychologist that you feel comfortable with and that you can share with, and being prepared to share, I think, is the main thing that somebody needs to be able to do, or hopefully would be able to do.
How affordable is it for a veteran to get help with their PTSD?
So veterans can access psychology services through DVA referrals, and there's no charge to them at Mates for Mates. And all our other activities are all free to our veterans. So there's no financial barrier that they have. We also see family members, and family members can access psychology or EP services, clinical services, with a Medicare referral as well.
How long does it take to recover?
I think it depends on the person. In my experience, I have some people who, will come for a few sessions and feel that they're okay and that they can, that they can kind of move on. And other people who'll come for an extended period of time. I think it very much depends on the person. person and other things that are going on for them as well.
Does medication play a role in recovering from PTSD?
Yes, it can do, definitely. And we certainly would, talk to any clients we have about the benefits of seeing a psychiatrist, potentially looking at medication and the types of symptoms that may help manage. I think it's an important part of recovery to consider.
In what ways can the recovery sector improve?
I know that there can be quite long wait lists to see a psychologist. I'm well aware of that. Certainly in the Brisbane area, I know there is, and I think that there aren't maybe quite as many psychologists as we like, and wait lists can be long, and I think that can certainly impact on recovery, because the sooner that you get support, the more likely you are to be able to, help manage things before it becomes really problematic. So I would say that's an important thing to think about.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Clare Mitchell, and we are discussing PTSD recovery in veterans. What are the ways that a family member of a veteran can help that veteran that does have PTSD?
I think understanding. So one of the recovery programs, skills for recovery programs that we have is our Partners and Carers program. And whilst there's some other things about self-care and, helping them to manage their own things, part of that activity or part of that program is around providing a bit of information about what PTSD looks like, providing some awareness so that they can support, so that they can be understanding and empathic. And I think that, often something that potentially becomes difficult when someone has PTSD is that interpersonal communication. If you're experiencing lots of symptoms, you may not want to talk to a loved one, and that can be really difficult for the loved one. That can put them at a disadvantage of knowing how to help. So I think, programs that increase awareness and increase the ability to communicate about the difficulties and how to get support from each other and how to kind of maintain that social support is really important. The other thing I would say for people who are caring for someone who's experienced PTSD or other mental health conditions is don't be afraid to ask for support yourself as well. I think that's really important. And often, when we're caring for someone else, often it's difficult to find time or energy for self-care. But when we're doing that, that becomes so much more important. So I think that's really important too.
In the recovery sense, how well do we understand PTSD? Do we still need to? Is there still some research that we need to do, or are we doing pretty good?
Look, I think PTSD is more understood than it used to be. I would say there's always more research that can be done. I think there's always extra things we can learn. There's always interventions that are being improved and developed, and I imagine that will continue with regard to PTSD as well.
Would you say that PTSD is something that it's not something that goes away 100%, but that it's something that's just kind of managed ongoing?
I mean, yes. The reality, as I mentioned, is that, someone who's experienced PTSD has experienced potentially a life-changing event. So that's not going to go away. It's how it's managed, I guess, that can change. So in that sense, yes, it is about managing it, but that doesn't mean that those ongoing difficulties, symptoms, challenges have to continue to impact your functioning, even whilst you kind of learn to live with that difficult experience that you've had.
Do you think that wider society understands PTSD?
I think that's a difficult one to answer. I think. I don't know what wider society generally thinks, I guess, but I would imagine that unless you were really, interested and took an interest in that, it would be maybe hard to know exactly what PTSD looks like. Potentially, maybe we have ideas of what we think that looks like, and that may differ a little bit from what it actually is. I mean, certainly I know that, some of the veterans that we see, some of the clients that we have maybe aren't aware that they have PTSD, and that's happened on, a number of occasions. So given that, I think we can say that, people sometimes really don't maybe have too much of an understanding of what it looks like. I think it's more, maybe there's more awareness now. Certainly, we're aware that there might be other people who may have more of a tendency to suffer from PTSD, police, first responders, that kind of thing. And I think there is a little bit more awareness around that as well.
Is it possible for somebody to recover from PTSD but then relapse?
Yes, that can happen, as I guess it can happen with all mental health conditions as well. And if that happens, then, we'd always recommend going back to a psychologist, getting further support. Because if that's helped in the first, helped initially, then it's probably going to help again. In terms of, I suppose, the treatment, part of the treatment is to develop some relapse management strategies, develop some strategies that help people maintain their well-being. And life gets busy, and I guess those sometimes can drop off, and that might be when we see problems. Or people may experience another trauma that brings up those old feelings, and that can certainly happen.
When someone does undertake recovery, how can their life change for the better?
In lots of different ways. I guess in terms of kind of general functioning, they're probably going to be more able to sustain effective relationships with people. They're probably going to be able to, engage in social networks that maybe they haven't, especially if they've experience those kind of beliefs about the world not being safe, people not being safe. It can be really hard for people to engage effectively, and we know how important it is for us to be connected, for human beings to be connected. So that can certainly change. I think that, some of the other symptoms, the mood swings, that can make it difficult for people to engage in other activities. They don't want to go out. They don't like going to work. They don't want to go to a shopping centre. I think it can impact in, social, occupational, all of those areas of their lives, and it can just make it easier to function in those domains.
What would be the take home from this interview, Claire, that you'd want people to remember the most?
I'd want people to remember that support is out there, and certainly, for veterans, Mates for Mates, it is certainly one of the organisations that are available to support mates, and to not be afraid to ask for help.
My guest today was Clare Mitchell, psychologist and National Clinical Manager of Mates for Mates. This is the last episode in our series on PTSD. Coming up on the show for the next month, we're going to be talking to a range of professors from the University of Newcastle, Australia. And if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.